This lecture will be the final one in the first section of the Survey of Western Art to 1300, leading up to the Renaissance. In this lecture, we will be covering how the Gothic spreads and how its manifestation can be felt in Germany and Italy. In this period, we find that the Holy Roman Empire, what will become Germany, Austria, and part of northern Italy, is going to cease to be a significant power by the 1200s. This section, this geopolitical entity, had been established by Charlemagne, who was the first Holy Roman Emperor. Alternatively, England and France had grown in power as strong nation-states. The Holy Roman Empire, on the other hand, had lost its control of southern Italy and Sicily to the Normans earlier on, and then we find they will be conquered by the Spaniards. The emperors, in fact, at this period, only have nominal authority over these dozens of independent principalities, each one ruled over by a duke and or a local magistrate, who actually have the power in the Holy Roman Empire. As in England, we find that, here in Marburg, the regional adaptation of the French Gothic can be seen. That is not going to take all of the characteristics the French appreciate, but instead adopt that which they find to be appropriate. Now, at this time, we have an increasing importance placed on sermons in Germany, given their distance from the papacy. And so we develop a particular type of church that is unique to Germany, known as a hall church, or Hallenkirche. This particular hall church, that of St. Elizabeth of Hungary, is going to be the first true Gothic hall church, which would afterwards be widely adopted throughout Germany. Now, St. Elizabeth was a Hungarian princess who married the ruler of Thuringia. However, he died of the plague. Therefore, she set herself to caring for the sick, especially incurable diseases, from that point onward. She was so beloved that the Knight of the Teutonic Order is going to build a church that serves as her mausoleum and a center of pilgrimage for her, and that's what the church we see before us here today is. The Knights Templar were one of the many orders that went to Jerusalem on crusade. The Teutonic Order were like the Knights Templar, that instead came back to Germany from Jerusalem, whose black cross is the basis for the German cross we see on military arms and armament throughout the 20th century. If we are to compare the facade of the Church of St. Elizabeth with a Gothic example in France, such as Reims Cathedral, we notice immediately how Spartan, how pared down and grave the St. Elizabeth Germanic Hall Church appears by comparison. We find that we do not have nearly as much encrusted sculptural nor sculptural decoration. Instead, this hall church appears much more akin to the Westwerk designed by and for Charlemagne in the Carolingian area and carried on elsewhere in Germany. It is seen as distinctly Germanic, hence it is strong, heavy, and weighty, with these two towers and clear masonry construction supporting it. This robust quality from Romanesque and Carolingian architecture was also appreciated by the English, though they are going to have many more areas dedicated to stained glass, specifically the lancet window designs. The plan for St. Elizabeth is also very distinct from its French counterparts, such as that of Reims at Notre Dame. Here we find that the plan is a German trefoil or three-lobe design, where the choir and transepts are equal distance and size, and are repeated. This motif will be carried on in many different areas associated politically with Germany. In the plan for a hall church, we notice that the nave and side aisles are going to be the same length, that they're going to represent a floor plan that is going to be light-filled and open, with an interior specifically designed to accommodate crowds for sermons, not necessarily for mass or processions. This design is distinct from the French, who are going to emphasize verticality, looking upwards, drawing your eye that direction. Instead, now we're pulled forward, much more akin to the English Gothic designs in churches, such as Salisbury, where we find that the groin vaulting is going to have lancet instead of rose windows, again more akin to the English. So the Germans will associate themselves, not surprisingly, with the English and their counterparts because of the dissimilarity they wish to display politically and stylistically from their rivals, the French. Turning to the Cathedral of Magdeburg, otherwise known as the Cathedral of Saints Catherine and Maurice, we have a great example of German realism that is very distinct from what is seen in France at the time. Here we have the relics of Saint Maurice, an Egyptian African commander in the Roman army who was martyred in 286 with his Christian battalion while stationed in Germany. So that is how this Egyptian made his way and his relics to this German church. Now, Saint Maurice, because he is going to be African, is shown here for the first time as a black African. Now, this is a great example of the German Gothic, for the sculpture associated with German art is going to be defined by its interest in realism. So here we have sculpture that is carved not after a classical statue, not after another work of art, but instead an individual who lived at the time. And so we get a greater psychological presence and sense of realism associated with it. So again, this is the first example of Maurice as a black African because he had Egyptian origins, which is of course quite significant if you look over the history of Western Europe and its art. Because the Germans are the only ones, that being these northern artists, who depict ethnographic specifics among European nations. Here we have an example later on of Matthias Grunwald and the meeting of St. Erasmus and Maurice. Now, the interest in ethnographic specificity is actually going to be a Roman bequeathment to the Germans, for they are going to also appreciate recording the specific clothing, markers, and facial features of the peoples they conquer. Now, unlike Saint Theodore, which is a great example of a military saint in France, we have the same level of detail in the chainmail and the riveted leather. However, we do not have the classical contrapposto or shifting of weight with Saint Maurice. Instead, he stands upright, equally distributing his weight to both legs. In addition, we note that Saint Theodore is based on a French type, even though this saint would have lived and died in different countries. We find that Saint Theodore is shown as a French aristocrat with long curly hair, clean shaven, with French features. Therefore, most cultures are going to show their heroes, saints, or gods in the same way they would show themselves, either as white, black, as once again a particular ethnicity. We view once again the world through our own eyes. Now, at Naumburg Cathedral, we have another example of this type of specificity and realism in a series of polychromed sculptures, much like that of Maurice, but in this case, imitating those found in Sainte-Chapelle. So very self-consciously, the Germans are going to model a lot of their work in competition with the French. In this instance, Louis IX's commissioning of apostles that decorate the wall piers down below on low consoles in Sainte-Chapelle. Now, in competition with them, we have a series of sculptures that are going to be designed to seem in the same way, and of course presented on the same pedestals, and also polychromed, but not of apostles. Instead, they're going to illustrate burial chapels and the families that owned these various areas to bury their relatives. Here we have a very well preserved example of this Germanic Gothic sculpture that is polychromed or painted to look as lifelike as possible, with Eckhart and Uta. Now the portrait-like couple here is produced for a family burial chapel, and they are life-size. They include 12 ancestors on pedestals at window level, again meant to relate to the 12 apostles at Sainte-Chapelle. Now these two individuals are not going to be portraits of the original individuals they represent, for they had been dead since the 2nd century. But the best way to record the likeness for a family would be to use live models. Therefore, these are the ancestors of the original Eckhart and Uta in the Naumburg Cathedral. The figures can be compared to the visitation group at Reims, in that they represent an excellent French Gothic courtly approach to the drapery that rhythmically is going to sweep side to side as they are in S-shaped poses. Eckhart and Uta, on the other hand, have a very subtle contrapposto and are dressed in wool garments, which almost everyone would be wearing at the time. Hence, it is more naturalistic and observed, for this is what contemporaries would be wearing. In addition to the posing and the visitation figures, we have an alternative anecdotal interest with Eckhart and Uta, for we find not only is his portly face and his double chin reminiscent of someone's actual features, but we find he also lifts up the strap on his shield with his right hand as it is pinching him to adjust it. We find that Uta as well is going to be polychromed, and unlike the French examples at Sainte-Chapelle, she pulls the drapery, her cloak, over her face as though she is cold, as it would be in these churches, these very drafty churches. Therefore, we have carefully observed anecdotal details that go along with the carefully observed physiognomy of this German couple. This interest forms the basis for German Renaissance naturalism to come in the following centuries, and championed by artists like Albrecht Dürer, who is going to become the Leonardo of the North. A very different interest and situation is going to be developing in Italy, for the tumultuous history where this peninsula will be conquered by various powers throughout the Middle Ages is slowly developing its own independence and its own nationality. Here we find that the Holy Roman Empire will lose control of southern Italy and Naples by the middle of the 1200s. In the north, we also find, interestingly enough, independent city-states or communes will be developing with communal governments. Hence, we find these republican governments are going to be great patrons of the arts. One of those is going to be Pisa, which we looked at during the Romanesque period. At Pisa, we have an area where, since Charlemagne, Holy Roman emperors have sent artists to study, fostering this classical revival in an attempt to control Italy, but also this tradition. Frederick II was the last ruler of Italy. He was also a poet, an artist, and a naturalist, and encouraged his own artists to study ancient sculpture there. One of the best collections of ancient sculpture, believe it or not, did not come by way of freestanding examples such as the Belvedere collection in the Vatican, but instead in the Campo Santo, that rectangular structure seen here behind the baptistry, had one of the best collections in the later Middle Ages of Roman sarcophagi. So artists could actually look at what Romans had produced and model their own works on that type of monumentality and powerful representation, especially of relief friezes. The Camposanto, importantly, is going to be a burial place where dirt from Jerusalem was brought back so that the elite of Pisa could be buried in the same soil as their savior. Here we have examples like the Phaedra and Hippolytus sarcophagus, which illustrate the classical relief frieze that Renaissance artists to follow would be so inspired by, where we have monumental figures that are going to be on a unified ground plane that are read left to right, just like a book. Now, that type of art would inspire the artist to create reliefs such as can be found in the baptistry pulpit in Pisa. This one specifically designed by Nicola Pisano, or Nicholas the Pisan, which is roughly 15 feet tall, still there today. Now, this artist was a leading proponent of the new classical approach to art and a new or renewed naturalistic style in sculpture. Now, the associations that we have here with the Germans or the Holy Roman Empire cannot be overlooked, for we have a six-sided hexagonal pulpit with Corinthian capitals supporting these standing figures, but with Gothic trefoil arches referencing the Germans, just as the Hallenkirche had as well with the three-lobe design. Here, in the most famous of the panels, the Annunciation, Nativity, and Adoration of the Shepherds, we have a single relief panel that has multiple episodes from the early life of Christ, beginning in the back left with the Annunciation that Gabriel gives to the Virgin Mary, that she will become pregnant and give birth to the Son of God, to the massive reclining Virgin in the center after she has given birth and the Christ child is being washed off by these nursemaids below, with Joseph watching on in the lower left-hand corner. And finally, in the upper right-hand corner, an adoration to the shepherds as the angels announce where to find Christ. This is known as a continuous narrative, where multiple episodes of the same story can be found within the same picture plane, thus maximizing the narrative and the space and the materials involved, so that we can see what happens over a larger chronological period. The design for Pisano's pulpit here, and the figures within, is directly inspired by the sarcophagi found in the Camposanto, such as the Phaedra and Hippolytus sarcophagus, where we find examples of massive reclining women of these standing figures, all monumentalized and brought together. The figure of the Virgin is, of course, going to be based on that of Phaedra here, as we find this classical matriarch in the Roman tradition leans on her right arm and elbow and supports herself with this veil over her head. The monumentality, of course, is going to communicate the power of this woman, just as it is going to the bulk and power of the Virgin Mary here. The revival of ancient Roman sculpture and art, and its influence on that in the Gothic in Italy, is but one component that leads to the Renaissance. Another very important and often overlooked event is actually going to be the sacking of Constantinople in 1204 by Western Europeans led by the Venetians, as we find a war with the Turks is going to follow. At this time, Christians are going to rule over an eastern portion that was left over of the Roman Empire. And so they speak Greek, they were Christians, and they were allies of the Western Christians, the Latin Christians as well. However, we find that the Western powers found it easier to sack Constantinople than making their way entirely to Jerusalem during the Fourth Crusade. Now, when they are able to regain control of their country, the Byzantines had already lost a considerable amount of territory, and we find that Muslims flooded in, leaving a large number of refugees to flee this area, to flee over through the Mediterranean to areas that are friendly to Christians, specifically ports along the Italian peninsula. They brought with them the maniera greca, or the Greek manner, artworks in the style of Orthodox Christianity in Byzantium. The format for these new works in the Maniera Greca were very often icons. So the refugees brought these portable paintings that were used for private devotion. These become the model for early modern painting, and the format we all take for granted today, which would be an easel painting mounted on a wall. This form of painting did not exist in the West as we know it. The most common type of painting, in fact, in Europe at the time, outside of painting sculptures, would be crucifixes that were not mounted on a wall, but instead would hang on choir screens or from above an altar as seen here. The style for these crucifixes was immediately influenced by the Maniera Greca, which is going to be defined by that emphasis in contours, in chrysography, and on the suffering appropriate for these crucifixion scenes brought over from Byzantium. The historiated crucifix seen here, where we have a massive body of Christ on a cross, with additional narrative scenes and episodes from the Passion, are going to become quite common and popular, especially in the late 1200s in Italy. Here we have episodes where Christ is led to the cross, where he dies and is taken off the cross and entombed, where he resurrects and judges above, based on the Pantocrator from the Byzantine tradition that we have already discussed, where he holds the book. He holds up his right hand in a blessing of benediction and is identified in this body mandorla and the halo behind his head as Christ the Judge. The comparison between Copo di Marcavoldo's crucifix and that we discussed in the Church of Dormition at Daphne is going to be quite obvious. We find here we have an emphasis on the incised lines, the contours that make up Christ's musculature and body, as it sags to the left, his head looking down to his right and our left, towards the saved, just as in the Second Coming and crucifixion scenes and the Last Judgment scenes, he looks down to the saved. We find that this is the Christus Patiens, the suffering Christ. The faces of the figures also are going to be contorted, yet at the same time drawn quite clearly, with the souring and the scowl seen very clearly in Christ's brow and forehead. Now, this type of interest in and influence of the Maniera Greca is not going to be the most significant thing brought by Greek refugees. The format of painting is. Now, what we also find happening at the same time in Italy is unique for anywhere in Europe for its emphasis on naturalism and anecdotal detail, seen in examples like fresco cycles at Assisi. At Assisi, we find a new mendicant or begging order, one dedicated to the urban poor, is going to find the Franciscans being founded, approved by the Pope in 1209 to 10. Now, St. Francis of Assisi is going to be today the head saint and the most popular protector of Italy, and of course the world over is one of the most popular saints. He is canonized in 1228. The son of a wealthy merchant, we know that by tradition he gives away all of his earthly possessions and devotes his life to the urban poor. Hence, he founds a mendicant order. What is interesting about the founding of the Franciscans and other mendicant orders like the Dominicans is that they represent, by their very foundation, the economic expansion that we see in the 1200s, which saw the growth of an urban poor. You cannot have urban poor without an urban population. Hence, this is the final step away from feudalism and the foundation of modern European capitalism. In an ironic twist, the popes who seek to canonize St. Francis and bring him within the Catholic fold commission for this man who dedicated his life to the poor the richest and most lushly decorated church of the day, which now is going to be a pilgrimage church to St. Francis himself and the town of Assisi where he was from. This massive church, perched on top of a hillside, is going to be modeled very similarly after Sainte-Chapelle. for it has an upper and a lower story, and functions as a pilgrimage church for the saint who was buried, just like at Old St. Peter's, in the area directly below the main altar. As with Old St. Peter's, X marks the spot, because the crypt is at the choir end underneath both, the crossing right directly beneath it. The cycle of frescoes below by Cimabue, and then those above by the Master of Assisi, are going to be important when thinking of how we move ahead to the Renaissance. The upper church is in fact well lit and uninterrupted by anything on the walls, so it is designed for large fresco cycles instead of broken up by pier clusters or additional stained glass windows. They illustrate the life of St. Francis, flanked by Old Testament scenes, hence anchoring this new saint into the typological tradition of the past. The stories shown here are going to be designed to engage spectators, to engage viewers in an appeal to life experiences, things that we have all seen, that we have all done. Hence, we're emphasizing recognizable anecdotal details and naturalistic space over supernatural visions. In the Miracle of the Crib at Greccio, you have one of these examples where St. Francis is going to set up a nativity scene with the ox and the axe, with once again a baby doll for the Christ child. And then those present are going to witness a miraculous vision of what it was like to be at the nativity. But it is presented not in an emphasis of the supernatural aspects of the story, but anchoring it into something we would see in this very church through naturalistic details. Now, this is set in the present Gothic church, where the oral component we see of individuals singing, we would hear as well with friars singing in this church, because it is, of course, also a monastery with Franciscan monks in it. The cross that we see here in the choir screen dividing the nave from the choir is the back of a crucifix, much like the one we saw a moment ago with Copo di Marcovoldo's design. So now we can see behind the scenes, quite literally, of what this church visit would have been like. People dressed in contemporary attire. We're looking at contemporary architecture. This approach and tradition of having a contemporary setting, but involving a recognizable crowd, right, is not going to be new. We're setting this in a recognizable place, but moving into a much more naturalistic presentation of the event. This is going to lead to the Italian Renaissance, as the artist Giotto, who that last work was mistaken for, is considered to be the first Renaissance artist by Giorgio Vasari, the biographer for the Renaissance itself. The end of the Middle Ages, in fact, is going to see everything we need for the Renaissance to flourish. A renewed interest in naturalism and anatomy, access to Greco-Roman architecture, sculpture, writings, the growth and expansion of urbanization, people moving to cities, the development of capitalism, which gives rise to banking and then powerful patrons like the Medici, to individualism and humanism, this notion that individuals are significant and have agency and can control their worlds. Next class, please review your notes and be prepared for the final exam. Study guides are available.